You see foreign aid that goes to basically fund gay pride events in Prague. Every agency you look at is either weaponized or it's woke, and most of the time it's both. And we just have had a bunch of spreadsheet warriors, and I come from that community, to be clear. And as a result, we wonder, why haven't we had any spending victories since Newt Gingrich? Instead of it being about a 15, 20, 30% cut to the Department of Education, it's how could you spend $1 on the Department of Critical Race Theory? How could you spend $1 at the NIH place that produced the gain of function research that helped cause the COVID pandemic?
All right, folks, it is Tuesday. This is the Sean Spicer Show. I'm excited that you're with us today. You know, these conversations that we're going to have over Thanksgiving, and it may not just be that one meal, but maybe it's one that you have before or after, whatever. So many times I find myself talking about government spending, how crazy it is, where we are as a country, the amount of debt that we're racking up. And I thought to myself, the nut of this show is how to understand what's really happening, to bring you inside the belly of the beast. Not just to complain about it, but to understand it so we can affect change, right? So today we have Russ Vought. Russ Vought was the director of the Office of Management and Budget for President Trump. He came in day one. I was with him. He was the deputy director. When he started, he fleeted all the way up to director by the time he left. And Russ Vought has been working on budget issues for years. He was the head of the Republican Study Committee in the House of Representatives, really focused on budget issues there. He worked for the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action, making sure that members of Congress were held accountable for spending. He understands this issue probably better than anybody. But he has left, after he left the administration, he founded the Center for Renewing America. And these guys are really presenting alternatives to the members of Congress to get our budget back on track, to understand the nuances of spending, the dangers of debt, all of the things that we're dealing with. And we have a lot to break down with him today, because part of this is the types of spending. We've got discretionary spending. That's the kind that deals with roads and bridges and the Defense Department, education. And we've got entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicaid, veteran spending. That's the stuff that's on autopilot. But one of the big dangers right now beyond both of those is the interest on our debt. With rising interest rates, this thing's going out of control. It's squeezing out the ability to, it's literally like that on your credit card, right? How much do you have to pay every month, regardless of what you bought? That's what our interest on the debt is right now. And we are crowding out the ability to spend every day without doing anything, because not only are we spending more, therefore racking up more debt, but interest rates are going up. So we're paying more and more to service the debt. It is dangerous, dangerous. And I think what I want to talk to Russ about is, where are we in our spending? What can we do? Who is the problem? How do we get to the bottom of this? And how does the next Republican administration actually get in there and start on day one? So let's kick off a discussion with Russ Vought and enlighten all of us as we head into Thanksgiving. Here we go. Russ, good to see you. Thanks for being with us on this Thanksgiving week.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
You bet. You know, it's funny. I think a lot of families, probably mine included, as we sit around the Thanksgiving table, somehow the dysfunction of government is going to come up. And somehow that always leads to discussion of government spending. I literally was just having this discussion earlier today with someone about how taxes are too high. And I said, well, that's because your government wastes a lot of our money and they need more in taxes. As somebody who's been involved in this for a serious amount of time in terms of budget reforms, on the House side in Congress and then on the federal side, what is that existential answer to why can't we get government spending under control?
My belief is that for a very long time, we've had budget cutters who have been unwilling to take the approach of what you just described, of families at the table discussing their finances in the way that they would go about it. And the first thing that they would go after would be their discretionary funding, the waste, the things that they look at in the mirror and they just can't justify. And they hear stories of this all over, whether it's just whether it's just flat out waste, the NASA space camp in Pakistan, or increasingly more woke and weaponized versions where you're actually paying for teachers to produce cultural revolutionaries in the school system. And then you see, we're paying for people to have first-class tickets at the airlines as part of the refugee resettlement that, of course, is just illegal immigrants by another name. And they find that outrageous. And we've lost the ability to have that type of spending cuts that can lead to big numbers down the road over time. I believe that we've been lost in a kind of a political cul-de-sac for far too long as we focused on what many perceive as the big ticket items. And in the process, we've lost the common sense of the American people who would be this and are not going to be able or willing to go for harder stuff if the waste is still there.
All right, folks, I want to tell you about a guy named Leo Grillo that I've gotten to know. He is the founder of Delta Rescue. And if you go to deltarescue.org, you can get to see some of the great work that Leo has done to provide the world's biggest sanctuary for abandoned dogs, cats, animals of all stripes. It is amazing what they do at Delta Rescue right now. This dog that he found at one time was in trouble and underway. Leo rescued that dog. It was a Doberman and named him Delta. You know why? Because that inspired Delta Rescue. It's unbelievable what they do over there. Delta stands for dedication and everlasting love to animals. That's basically Leo's mission. And Delta Rescue relies solely on contributions from people like you and I to make it work. Talk to them about making this part of your estate plan. If you're an animal lover, you know this is where your legacy can match with theirs, and they can help put together a tax-saving plan. It's all on their website right now. So go to deltarescue.org, check out some of the great videos and the estate planning tools that they have there on their site for you. You know, it's funny. I've had this conversation to some degree or another with different guests, but I remember when they were running out, what was it called? The Commitment to America or something last cycle, the House candidates and Kevin McCarthy. And I had this discussion with a bunch of them and I said, do you remember in 94, Newt Gingrich used to hold up this ice bucket and he would tell the story that back in the day before refrigeration, the members of Congress would have an ice bucket delivered to their offices every single morning, filled with ice in a bucket. And that was, you know, how they could keep things cool. Well, it never ended. So up through the 1990s, every member of Congress would have ice delivered to their office, even though at that time, obviously, they had a refrigerator and a freezer in their office. And Newt's point was it was very illustrative of the waste in government. And he was basically trying to say, I'm going to eliminate this. And the idea wasn't so much the ice bucket. Who cares? Like, it probably costs 2 staffers and a couple ice buckets. So let's call it a few $100,000. But his point was, I'm going to go after everything. I'm going to treat your money with respect. And I think sometimes when I bring this up with members of Congress and I say, I get it, some of the big ticket items might be a bit more controversial. But at some point, you guys don't even seem to care about the pennies and the nickels and the dimes anymore. And everybody will give me this conversation about how, well, it's tough and da-da-da-da-da in the process. So why can't some of those things, just the bare minimum, get done?
Well, honestly, I think it's because it's a paradigm shift that we've had for too long. And some of our best budget cutters, and many of them you and I worked with and over the years, just have forgotten the importance of this lesson. And it's not just wasteful. I mean, the stuff that government is increasingly spending money on, you would rather burn it in a parking lot because it is so bad for communities and families in our country. And so my goal has been to elevate the moral high ground of going after, like, we're not talking about just cutting Department of Homeland and of Housing and Urban Development where it's about homelessness. No. This is about a fair housing network that strategizes to go into communities and break up single family neighborhoods and forces apartment complex down their throats. That's the kind of thing that you're seeing. You see foreign aid that goes to basically fund gay pride events in Prague or activities in Senegal. You see it everywhere. Every agency you look at is either weaponized or it's woke. And most of the time it's both. And we just have had a bunch of spreadsheet warriors. And I come from that community, to be clear, but they're not necessarily political strategists. And as a result, we wonder, why haven't we had any spending victories since Newt Gingrich? And it's because Newt brought the ability to think on that level as well.
But is it so if you had to isolate it, is it the House staff? Is it the House members? Is it the federal bureaucracy? But I feel like everybody points the finger at each other and says, well, the members didn't know because the staff told them to do it and they don't have the time to get in the weeds. And the staff says, well, the federal bureaucracy forces us to do certain things. And it's a merry-go-round of pointing the finger at each other.
I think it is two places that are the problem. Number one, it is those that benefit from the focus
Right.
not being on the appropriations each year, and they're the word. That's your defense hawk community, and it is your appropriators themselves. they're the ones that are going to lead the manager constantly to the appropriations. And then it's one part, the budget cutters that I've just have gotten kind of in a political cul-de-sac. That said, we have turned the corner this year in the ability to, for the first time, we have a renewed enthusiasm on the House appropriation during the appropriations process with Speaker Johnson of doing regular order. And you're seeing it. It's taken a little bit longer than I would like to, but this is what it begins to look at. There's a lot more momentum now for the annual process, which, by the way, Sean, as you know, that's the only thing they have a vote on every year.
Right.
All the mandatory stuff is on autopilot. They don't have a vote on that. Discretionary, you vote on every single year, and they've basically concocted, some pretty sophisticated ways of making it sound like that's just a meaningless process when it's not.
So just for the folks that are doing planning for their Thanksgiving dinner and want to go in with the tools, right? Walk us through. I mean, the way I think it, there's three types of spending. There's discretionary spending, there's the mandatory spending, and then there's interest on the debt, which to some degree is an aspect of mandatory spending. Walk us through so that people are armed in the next couple of days for those dinners, what the different types of spending are and what kind of constitutes some of the things in each of those categories.
Sure. So 2/3 of the federal government is largely mandatory spending, and a good chunk of that is Social Security, Medicare, but a lot of it's also Medicaid, Obamacare subsidies, welfare reform, and a third of it is what we call discretionary spending, and that a third is what they interact with when they think of the federal government. That's the agencies, whether it's the Department of Defense or the Transportation Department, that's the government that they interact with. And that's what's funded on an annual basis. And so we have conversations about, is the government going to shut down? This new continuing resolution extends to January 19th. That is primarily on that third of a discretionary spending, and everything else is on autopilot, including the portions of the agencies that run those programs.
So when you say, just so I'm clear, when you say autopilot, that means that basically Congress doesn't have anything to do with that 2/3 piece of the pie, right? It just by law it grows and it pays out, right?
Correct, because it's built on the basis of laws that are on the books that say this benefit, whatever it is eligible to the following people if they come in the door. And we call them entitlements because that law has made them an entitlement to them. And it's quite frankly a bad way to run a government, in the sense that you've lost the ability for Congress to opine each year with what these programs should look like. And so we certainly don't want to ensure that more and more parts of the government are funded that way, which is why we effectively have this process where that's occurred, because members of Congress don't actually want to do what this hard work during the annual appropriations process. So we're starting to see something new, and that's a good thing.
All right, friends, are you looking to secure your financial future? Then I ask you to call the folks at Bishop Gold Group. They are who I rely on during these uncertain economic times, interest rates going through the roof. Where do we put our money? What's secure? Bishop Gold Group is America's premier precious metals company. They can sit down with you and put a plan together about whether it's an IRA, you're a first-time investor, you're a long-time investor, how to diversify, what metals to get into. I have known these guys for quite some time. Integrity is a way of life for them. Transparency is something that they pride themselves on. When you call them, they sit down, create an individualized plan for you based on your specific needs. I know there's a lot of companies out there talking to you about precious metals. Trust me, you will not be disappointed with my friends over at Bishop Gold Group. You can reach out to them and talk to them right now at 844-984-1616, or click on the link below, bishopgoldgroup.com/Sean, SEAN. And guess what? They've got a special promotion for you to start your financial independence journey. Again, bishopgoldgroup.com/Sean. So let's start with the discretionary stuff. When I hear stories that the Department of Defense can't pass an audit, shouldn't that send flags up? And instead, it's sort of like, okay, well, next year do better. But where's the impetus on trying to get these agencies to be accountable for the money that's being handed out? Because, I think about it. I remember when I started at the RNC, and we were coming on the heels of 20-something $3 million in debt. We literally went through the budget and we're like, okay, we don't need to have the newspaper delivered here. We don't need these subscriptions. And we literally would go line by line and say, what can we afford, what we can't? How many staffers can we afford with this allocation? And I feel like the federal government, even on the discretionary side, you mentioned the Department of Transportation, the Department of Defense, they don't even have an incentive to do the basics.
They don't. And DOD is probably the number one culprit because no one on the right, or very few, are willing to do what's necessary and to say, look, if you guys haven't passed an audit, we're not going to give you as much money. So they basically have a constant get out of jail free card. And we're dealing in such large numbers with an agency like that there's just a total breakdown in accountability. And I saw it in terms of the responsiveness that I would have at the Office of Management and Budget at the director. You'd ask Department of Labor for, hey, we need this information to know whether you're doing a good job. They would respond pretty well. You ask the Department of Defense, you'd have to throw some chin music at them to get their attention and to make sure that you were getting the information that was required, because there's just such a posture that that they don't have to go along with those normal constraints.
So then what is the answer for the Department of Defense, for example? Like what do we do? What would you, when you advise members of Congress, what do you tell them? Because to me, we're never going to solve the problem of actually reducing spending, getting our government under control, getting a real budget if there's no incentive or if there's no fixture to make it happen. So when you talk to these members of Congress and say, okay, as a guy that was the director of management and budget, here's what you need to do, or here's what can be done?
So I've urged Congress to really begin to flatten out their spending, at the very least do a freeze. And I could fund all of the major components that are necessary to keep us safe and confront China, even under a cut. But I think you've got to get out of this notion that they can continue to have certain percentage increases every year. You have to change their eye level in a fundamental way. And then what Congress is good at is using kind of talking points to suggest that that's what's necessary for a particular funding level. And you when a minute I say this, you'll recognize it. They'll say readiness. Well, our readiness is not at a particular level. And then you get, okay, what's the number of flying hours you need for a particular plane or pilot or fleet? We don't get down to the actual level. We basically just say at the talking point level, we need high levels of readiness, and so we're just going to throw a ton of money at them. And what we were trying to do particularly as we figured it out our last 2 years, is we were beginning to say, okay, we will keep us ready. That is a priority of Donald Trump, but we're going to be very specific about what that means. And we're going to give you metrics as to how you are doing. So you're not going to be able to just, tell us you have a problem and not give us an ability to measure that. And I think we increasingly need to move in that direction with some definition so that the military themselves can say, this is what our definition is of readiness. The second point I would say is where they really drive up the cost of these things is what the requirements that they feel like they need. And those are often policy decisions. The extent to which we are involved in Europe is a policy decision that then dictates the requirements of the number of troops in theater. And you look at a host of those different policy questions across the globe, and next thing you know, those are kind of like the mandatory drivers within defense, right? And they will often do kind of a bum's rush against you and say, well, you're not the military, so you can't tell us what our requirements should be to keep our troops and our fleets and our army safe. And but you got to be willing to get past that and say, look, these are policy decisions, and we have a right to be able to understand that as part of civilian control of the military. So that's another big one that comes at a solution. But from my perspective, you've got to win it at the paradigm level to say civilians are the ones that have to be in charge of the military for precisely these reasons.
It's just funny, though. I watched it was on Cheryl Atkinson's program a couple weeks ago, right? They were talking about these Navy projects where they were repairing ships that would never go back out to sea. And I'm thinking to myself, to the tune of tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. And yet when President Trump appointed me to the Naval Academy, we're going over the needs of the academy, and there's literally a bridge connecting one part of the campus to another that is imminently going to fall down, right? I mean, and doesn't affect readiness per se, but obviously getting the midshipmen from one side of the campus to another does affect their ability to go to class, graduate, et cetera, train the next level of leaders. And yet you juxtapose these two things and say, at the one hand, we're literally repairing ships that will never go back to sea to the tune of hundreds of millions. And then at the other hand, we literally have a justifiable project that can't get funded.
There's a litany of those types of examples. What comes with an over bureaucratic process, turf warfare, and ultimately that's what comes up when you have some version of the administrative state. And just because it's the military doesn't mean has aspects of the administrative state. And we're seeing that, quite frankly, in the fight with Senator Tuberville over these nominations holds. They don't want accountability. And they do everything.
So what
they
would
can
be knowing what you know now after those, you particularly point out those last 2 years of the Trump administration as OMB director. If Trump wins again and you can go in with that hindsight, what is the immediate change that you would make if you were OMB director or advising the new OMB director to say, here's how you can get at some of this?
Well, first of all, you've got to drive the priorities of a president. You've got to be able to tell them very early and on day one, day two, during a transition, these are the priorities. We are going to have this size fleet. So Army, you think you've got the same piece of the pie as Navy or the Air Force? No, that's not consistent with where the fight is headed for purposes of confronting China. And you've got to really dictate that. You've got to put that and then stay ahead of their bureaucratic gears so that dictates it. And as opposed to them taking the money, what they want is you give us a number, OMB, and we'll spend it, and then we'll give you an ability to react, right? That's what they want. And you just kind of flip it. And the second thing is you got to then, on the DoD side, you have to make sure that civilian control of the military is reflected in everything.
All right, guys, most of us know what it's like to be without power, sometimes for an hour, maybe a day, a couple days after a natural disaster, a hurricane, a windstorm, whatever. But now national security experts are warning that our power grid is more vulnerable than ever. And they've identified 9 key substations, which if attacked, they're saying we could lose power for months. That's why having your own solar power is more important than ever. So I recommend the Patriot Power Generator, which is a solar generator that you don't have to install in your house. It's portable. You can take it with you. You can use it inside your house. And it's powerful enough that if power goes out, we're talking your phones, your tablets, your computers, medical devices, even your refrigerator gets power. So if you go to 4patriots.com and use code SPICER, you get 10% off your first purchase. It's 4patriots.com, includes that Patriot Power Generator. You'll get that guarantee for a year, free shipping if it's over $97, and a portion of every sale is donated to charities that support veterans, right? That's great. So go to 4patriots.com, use code SPICER, 4patriots.com. You do not want to be without power in case something happens. Is there anybody in the Department of Defense, realistically, and I mean this at a high-ranking level, that is actually trying to look out for the taxpayer, or are they all like, hey, give us a number and we'll spend it?
There are people that CAPE tries to do things the best, most efficient way. And
What's
sometimes,
CAPE?
or sometimes it is the agency. It's like the OMB within DoD, right?
Okay.
And they often have good viewpoints on these things, but are they empowered or not? That depends on the deputy, right? And so most of the time, the answer to your question is a little more simple. It's like, no, there is no one thinking about it.
Right.
But what you want to do is empower those parts of the bureaucracy that's their job to be able to do things more efficiently, and that are willing to say no to some of these services when they produce their laundry list of goodies.
So, I want to get back to my ice bucket example for a second. I keep trying to tell some of these members of Congress when I have conversations with them is start with the simple. like push Democrats into a corner and get them to agree to cut outdated, inefficient, duplicative programs, and say, how, how can you support what these programs? Part of it is a messaging thing. Are they willing to take that on? But I think part of this, and this is what I think I'm hearing you say, is that there's not seem to be a ton of willingness or anyone to lead that fight right now.
There is not a willingness within the defense community and conservatives who are defense hawks. They benefit from these bureaucratic games that have existed to just keep churning out more spending. And the only where the help is going to come is from the budget community. And the budget community has been too focused on entitlements. So that's why my effort over this last year has been, here's how you balance the budget in a politically sustainable way, in a way that makes sense with the movement that brought Donald Trump to the White House. And by the way, is the most critical towards dealing with this government that's aimed at us, right? And if we could get those budget hawks and the budget community reoriented so that your best member of Congress is thinking along on those terms, then they will have a renewed interest in getting a handle on DOD or in defense. And the second way I look at it is I really work hard to make sure that people don't think I'm coming at these defense numbers from a libertarian perspective, right? I'm not just trying to isolate and not spend money and not have incredibly strong defense. But so I want to make trade-offs. I want to say, yeah, I want a huge Navy. I want a big Air Force. I want a smaller Army because I know that can scale over time. I want to fight less wars. That's how I approach it. And then you're constantly having a component versus component debate, and you can win those debates in Congress. And I've begun to realize that as I'm doing my same kind of tour through Congress and talking with people.
So, I want to get to interest for a second, but let me just ask you this, because you brought up balancing the budget. There are people that will say you can't balance the budget without looking at the entitlement side of the house. Is that true? And if not, what is a timeline in a realistic number of years it would take, and how would you have to do that just using discretionary?
So when I say you can balance the budget without touching the benefits of Social Security and Medicare, and you have to be able to put mandatory spending on the table that are not those two programs. And so my budget does that, and the budgets of President Trump did that because the political class has defined entitlements as those two programs and those two alone. You often have confusion on this point, but we have our budget balance is in 10, and a third of it was the discretionary savings, and two-thirds of it was welfare reform and changes to Medicaid and things of that nature. And I believe that that's the debate that you want to have. Let's go after the most wasteful, the most weaponized, the most woke, and then let's get people back to work. Let's take the social safety net that is out of control and has turned into a benefit hammock and get people back into the workforce. That two-pronged debate, I think, is entirely doable. And I also intentionally wanted to show that so that people would understand that to balance the budget, the only fiscal goal that the American people understand. We always want to talk about, well, we need a new one. Show me one that the family budget, the families around the table will understand, and I'll have that conversation. But until then, it's a balanced budget. And I wanted to show that you could do it without touching the benefits of Social Security and Medicare. And we've done that consistently in every budget under Trump and the one that I put out for the Center for Renewing America.
And where's the pushback when you do that? Is it that you're, quote, cutting Medicare or welfare? What is the immediate pushback when you do that?
The pushback from the left is that you are gouging the federal agencies, and I would say you're right. We are intentionally trying to do that, and that they would heartless cuts to the social safety net. So they would look at, what does this do for Medicaid? We have big reductions in Medicaid, but then I would point in Medicaid to the extent to which Medicaid itself is woke. Medicaid pushes the vaccine mandates. Medicaid's the one that's basically pushing for gender, mutilation and all sorts of gender transition surgeries. So woke policies are throughout those programs as well. And I think those are inconsistent with where the American people are at. And so I'm ready and willing to have that debate as well. And I think ultimately that's the debate you want to have, as opposed to um, talking about accounting shortfalls that people are well aware of, uh, and are cognizant of it. But they're ultimately, if you're not going to do about the stuff that we care about, then we're not going to pay attention to your accounting shortfalls.
So how much has rising interest rates, therefore the payment on interest seems to go up, how much is that changing the dynamic, and how concerned should we be about that aspect of the budget?
We should be pretty concerned. I mean, when I left office, we were spending about $350 billion per year in interest. Last year, we were
$350 billion on
per
interest.
year.
Think about what you could do with that money.
And it gets worse. I mean, last year we spent $700 billion on interest, and this year projections are that we're going to spend $1 trillion in interest alone. The deficit itself is about $2 trillion. So you think about that over the period of 10 years, and it's just astronomical. We're borrowing heavily to pay our own interest costs. So
just to stop that for a second, I don't love it. But we're literally borrowing money to make the interest payment.
Correct.
So we're using one credit card to pay the other credit card.
That's the real world implication of what we're doing. And
who's buying this debt?
Until you deal with that fundamental reality, you've got a host of fiscal issues, and it's only going to get worse as interest rates keep going up. I mean, interest rates on the 10-year Treasury was 90 basis points when I left, and now it's 4.5, and for a while it was at 5. So I think that my successors at OMB are going to have a very unpleasant time right about now as they're working on the budget that they'll unveil in February or March. They're having a very unpleasant time right now.
So you mentioned the entitlement programs in the budget that you've put forward, and the budgets under Trump that didn't get touched. But isn't that where one of the larger drivers is figuring out how to get some of that under control?
Sure, but the way I would look at it, Sean, is that I'm looking at it from the standpoint of where's the fight needed for the country, and are these mathematical drivers? Absolutely, but you could have the most amazing reform to one of these programs and fight through all the scare tactics and improve to the country that you haven't taken away any benefit that they needed or cared about. And the country would be no more free than the day before enactment. Because right now, the threat to our freedoms is coming from these agencies, and they need to be defunded. And that is the most critical central issue. And oh, by the way, if you can actually have some success there, you'll have won the American people over to them being able to deal with harder and harder things like welfare reform and other things. So that's really been my strategic approach, but it's not to suggest that these programs are on a fiscal footing that's sustainable, because I don't think they are. But I also believe that there's a significant merit to the political calculation of those that say, we need to go where the fight is, and over time you can make reforms that are consistent with the people that are benefiting from these programs and have for some time. And I think the other argument there that I would make is these programs had surpluses for decades. And Congress just literally spent that on their wish list. And so only the accountants will make an argument and say, well, that never really mattered. It wasn't their money. Well, that's not really the case. Those were their Social Security taxes and those Medicare taxes that went for these programs, and Congress spent it. So my view is that they should be at the back of the line as it pertains to where we go to find savings initially.
So when we hear that Social Security and Medicare are going bankrupt, how real is that, and should people be concerned?
They're going bankrupt in an accounting sense. The trust funds are running out of dedicated revenues for those programs. But the trust funds themselves have been a bit of an accounting exercise. I mean, that was the case with the Highway Trust Fund.
Right.
until it wasn't. And then, general funds went to subsidize it. I mean, is that a good thing? No, it's not a
Right.
good thing, but it's also not the end of the world. And so my view is you've got to approach the politics and the mechanics of this from a real world political, uh, in a real world political manner, and then make trade offs as statesmen will. And I think Donald Trump has made great trade offs on this front. And I think it's an instinct that will, if Congress would come alongside of him and bust through the power of the appropriators, we'd actually be able to make more spending gains than we would otherwise think possible. And he, just to talk about him for a little bit, he never got credit for putting forth budgets that had more spending cuts than any president in history. And you well know the attacks that came at our budget in those early weeks, and we had significant cuts in there. And I think that's where the fight should be, as opposed to the coalitions that are there supporting and attempting to keep the focus on Social Security and Medicare.
The interesting thing is we talk about the agencies and the programs and how to do it, but let's talk about the workforce for a second, right? Vivek Ramaswamy I had him on the show, I don't know, a week ago, and he said that he wants to fire everyone in the workforce with the Social Security number that ends in I think it was an odd number. It doesn't really matter. That's not the point. But his point is that if you just sort of use a system like that, it's actually permitted. Here's the first question I'd ask. Does that sort of mentality and method make any sense?
I think there's a lot to be said for large reduction in force type ideas and proposals. And, we're studying what Vivek has put out. And I think things like along those lines are definitely worth looking at. What the federal government can do, what can the president do unilaterally without relying on Congress, that he's doing for the benefit of the agency and to be run better, and for the American people's benefit, as opposed to just, it's not necessarily a funding decision, although it will have a funding implication that comes from it. But I love these ideas. And, if someone can show me the laws that exist to go even further, that's exactly the debate that I'd want to have.
But is going after the bureaucracy part of the answer?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to win the debate on going after the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, if you go agency by agency, the Department of Interior denying the license to the Drake Oyster Company that's had it for generations because the left asked them to going after Department of Labor, this consignment shop owner, because she provided discounts to poor women to come in early to be able to put tags on clothes and in exchange get cheaper clothes. You look at the EPA and they put a 77-year-old Navy veteran in jail for 18 months for building 4 ponds on his ranch to fight wildfire. Every single agency is like that. And my view is I want to take the debate to the country and on all of these spending fights. And instead of it being about a 15, 20, 30% cut to the Department of Education, no, it's how could you spend $1 on the Department of Critical Race Theory? How could you spend $1 at the NIH place that produced the gain of function research that helped cause the COVID pandemic? Like, I want to flip the moral high ground so that it's easier to win these votes in Congress, because in fact, the truth has been laid out that this funding is it's not that we can't afford it, which we can't. It's that it's actually harmful to the American people. We've never had that debate because we've always approached it on the basis of an accounting game.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I think there's always two sides to things. There's the policy piece and there's the messaging piece. And you keep talking about bringing this case to the American people. And I agree with you. I think that this is largely a messaging exercise where we need to explain to people how their money, how their tax dollars are being wasted. And I think that the question is, how do we start that process because I don't think people fully appreciate how wasteful, how duplicative the government is. How inefficient it is. And not just that, because I think a lot of people go, oh, it's just the government, but how much different it could operate. And that's the other thing, is that I think there's a part of this is baked in. They go, oh, it's the government, but there's a better way of doing things. And the question is, how do we approach this? Or I'll put it to you this way. Do you agree with me that it's a messaging problem that we've got to start communicating better with the American people and getting them on board with the problem that exists and the solutions that are available to them?
I do. I approach these questions on the basis of what's the real fight, forcing function, leverage point that will allow you to attract the American people's attention. So that's why I care a lot about debt limit expiration dates, funding expiration dates, because you take a hard line and you frame the fight on that hard line in such a way that as the American people are beginning to pay attention, they're not on Fox News, they're listening to whatever their country music channel is, and next thing you know, the news version of that morning says, oh, we have a funding fight. What do the two sides say? That framing, that simple framing is how you have to present the two sides. And let's take this as a case study this last year. Republicans win the majority, debt limits coming up. Initially, Republicans were starting to talk about Social Security, Medicare. I said, full stop talking about that. That's ridiculous. The fight should be on discretionary spending, caps, and every conversation you have should be woke and weaponized government. We got some
but
portion
for example,
there.
just to get in, I mean, like that's, I think a lot of people are saying, great, I agree with you. Like we've got critical race theory. You mentioned that Wuhan lab, all these things that people are saying, how do we fund stuff like that? And why aren't we fighting to stop that?
Well, again, we didn't get all the way there in the debt limit deal, but we have a chance to resurrect it on this funding fight. And you're increasingly seeing the ability, the speaker put out an interview, starts talking about woke and weaponized. Things are moving that direction. But ultimately, Sean, you've got to have a political class and Republicans willing to have brinksmanship.
Right.
And in the appropriations, part of why they haven't wanted to focus on appropriations is the fear, and I think it's a fear that's wrong-headed, of the implications of a shutdown fight.
Right.
And my view is you've got to use the exposure that comes with a shutdown to then explain to the people, these are what we're fighting over.
Yes,
and the country
that's why I'm saying
side.
It's a messaging fight. The thing that was so fascinating to me, Russ, is that when Speaker Johnson came out with this laddered approach, and I didn't fully appreciate it, like whatever. Everyone said it was nuts. It was stupid. The White House said they wouldn't sign it. Then he passed it and they all signed it. And my point is, Republicans need to be willing to fight a little. And to your point, you use the word brinksmanship. If we don't challenge the status quo and we don't say that things are wrong and that there's a different way and that we're willing to explain why people are having money spent on things that are ridiculous, then they don't know, and we're going to capitulate every time. Johnson at least was willing to take a shot at it, and I think he showed that you can fight and win.
Yeah, from your lips to God's ears. I mean, I think you could have positioned the fight a little bit better, but you're right. Like, first of all, they accept more than you think that they would, because they don't want to defend critical race theory and a government shutdown funding. Like, they don't. And we never put them on their heels with these cultural fights in a way that allows us to win. And I think that's precisely what we should be doing. But you've got to punch through some of the historical baggage that's largely untrue, and to explain to them, why they can continue to fight.
I agree. Russ, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think, and I'm being serious, I think a lot of people are going to sit down on their Thanksgiving dinner, whether it's at the table itself or, after they watch a game or two, whatever, and talk about how nutty the government is, because we've seen so much of this in the news. I hope that this conversation makes it to people either as they're driving on their way to dinner, and gives people some context, because it is so important. And I think the work that you have been doing, both as the director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump administration and now, is so critical to that debate and to our future. So thank you for joining us, and I wish you a very happy Thanksgiving.
You too, Sean. I appreciate it very much.
And just as a reminder, everybody, please continue to subscribe. Have a happy Thanksgiving. We've got a great show lined up for you tomorrow. Go on Apple, give us a 5-star review, subscribe there, YouTube, Rumble, hit the notification button. You can always text me, 571-441-4991. We'll see you right back here tomorrow on The Sean Spicer Show. Thanks for joining us. Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.